Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 29th meeting of the Justice Committee. We have apologies this morning from Shona Roberson, and I welcome Bill Kidd to the meeting, who's attending as her substitute, and we also have apologies this morning from James Kelly. Our first item of business is a decision on taking business in private. Does anyone disagree that the committee will consider all drafts of its report on the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill in private at future meetings? If you disagree, please indicate. No member has indicated that they disagree, so that is agreed. Our second item of business is to continue our consideration of the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill. We will take evidence this morning from two separate panels of witnesses, and these will be our final evidence sessions on the bill. And before I introduce the first panel, I'd like to say a few remarks correcting one aspect of the record from last week's oral evidence session. In evidence to the committee last week, Lucy Hunter-Blackburn referred to stickers that had been displayed at the University of Edinburgh which said woman, noun, adult, human, female. Lucy Hunter-Blackburn told us that the Scottish Trans Alliance suggested that people might want to refer those stickers to the police, and the university did so as potential hate incidents. Later in her evidence, Lucy Hunter-Blackburn said that the STA itself encouraged that process, unquote, of having the stickers referred to the police. And responding to this, Becky Kaufman, giving evidence to us on behalf of the Scottish Trans Alliance, said as follows, and I quote, "The STA was not approached and nor did we give any advice to anybody as to whether they should be referred," unquote. The following day, Becky Kaufman wrote to me via email to correct the record. She wrote to us in the following terms, and I'm going to quote her in full for the record rather than paraphrase and risk misrepresenting her, so I'm going to quote her in full. Since the session, she wrote, I've discovered that I was wrong to say that Scottish Trans Alliance was neither approached nor did we give any advice as to whether or not stickers should be referred to the police. I am now aware that one of my colleagues was approached by a journalist at the Times on 22 January 2019 asking for a comment on stickers that had been going up around Edinburgh University campus. My colleague emailed this quote to the journalist. If people feel distressed or alarmed by transphobic stickers they see posted around Scotland, we do encourage them to report this to the police. It is then a matter for Police Scotland to decide if they record this as a hate crime or not. The reason that we encourage people to report these sorts of incidents is simply that we want to improve trans people's confidence in approaching the police if they encounter something that they think may be a crime. Our Scottish LGBTI hate crime report found that just 2% of trans people had reported all incidents they felt may be hate crime to the police. This is unacceptably low. That's the end of the quotation given to the Times. Becky Kaufman goes on to say that this comment was not included in the Times in full, and instead, what was published was, if people feel distressed by transphobic stickers, we encourage them to report it to police. We want to improve trans people's confidence in approaching the police. Becky Kaufman concludes her email with the following. I apologize for this error yesterday, which was made in good faith, and just wanted to correct what I'd said. That's the end of the quotation from Becky Kaufman. I'm grateful to both Lucy Hunter-Blackburn and to Becky Kaufman for their evidence last week, and I'm very grateful to Becky Kaufman for writing to me to correct the record. The record has now been corrected. I consider this matter now to be closed, and the committee will move on, and it will move on specifically by welcoming, if I may, our first panel of witnesses this morning. We have with us Emma Rich from Engender, Susan Smith from For Women Scotland, and Dr. Marcia Scott from Scottish Women's Aid. I'd like to thank the witnesses for their written submissions, which are available, as always, for the public to read on the committee's web pages. And I'm going to move straight to questions, and I'm going to invite Annabel Ewing to open the questions to this panel of witnesses. Good morning, Annabel.
Good morning, convener. Good morning to our witnesses. Yes, I would like to start off our discussions this morning on the issue of the non-inclusion of the characteristic of sex as a hate crime predicted characteristic in the bill. And it would be interesting to hear the views of each of our witnesses on what they think about that, and if they think that the current approach being proposed of this working group on misogynistic harassment is the better way to go or not, and if they feel that in adopting that approach there could be any gap in protection whilst the work of that working group plays out. So perhaps I could go first for the to advise Burgh, to Dr. Marcia Scott, and then to Emma Rich, and then to Susan Smith, please. Thank you.
Sure. I think it's maybe worth pointing out that 10 or 15 years ago, when we were first contemplating the possibility of adding sex as an aggravation, I was, I would say, instinctively in favor of it. And as somebody who has spent 35 years working on women's rights and in violence against women sectors, you know, my gut was that anything that would help people understand the enormous violation of human rights that violence against women is was a good thing. And I have to say that obviously, you know, you'll know from our submission that our assessment of the impact on women, women who are experiencing violence against women, and the more general population of adding sex as an aggravation actually wouldn't do them any favors, and in fact might have some unintended negative consequences. And that's because I've actually looked at the evidence, and there's not a huge amount of evidence in the area, but the evidence that we do have says that in fact this is not likely to help, and I think it's likely to harm. I think there is a gap in protection, but the reality is, we all know, and this committee will know better than I, certainly in terms of being expert about the law, that an aggravation only works in the context of a piece of legislation that and something that's against the law. And we have those laws in place now. The aggravation is not going to fill a gap that is existing, and my biggest concern about adding it is that we really struggle with women being treated as a minority, and the reality is that something much bolder needs to happen in order to shift this very large ship of misogyny and misogynistic crime. And I think that the very strong possibility, if we do this and nothing else, is that, you know, a lot of folks will tick the box. We've added gender to the aggravation. We don't have to worry now about women. We don't have to worry about the fact that it is really theoretically impossible to put this aggravation in place in the context of our equally safe policy. And we can go on, and we'll be back here at the same place 10 years from now saying, well, that didn't work. So, and I'm too old for that. We need to do something different, because what we've been doing doesn't work.
Can I thank Dr. Scott for the answer, and just before we're going to Emma Rich, maybe if I could just pick up on one point that Emma maybe could helpfully try to respond to. Well, 2 points actually. One, that deals with the statutory aggravation issue, but also, of course, there's the stirring up offence issue as well, and perhaps Emma Rich could address that point. And I just wonder, in light of Marcia's comments, what would be the problem with doing both? So, from your perspective, Emma, you know, going ahead with the characteristic of sex in the bill as we're currently looking at it, and having this working group looking at a standalone offence. So perhaps I could go to Emma now. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the question. So, I mean, Engender and other national women's organisations are very used to working incrementally. And I shared Dr. Scott's view that when we came to the issue of hate crime, we were instinctively in favour of it. Even if it just gives women a small measure of protection, surely that's worth doing now while we wait for something better to come tomorrow. But I think we do see perhaps 4 critical risks in going forward with a let's just do this now, and also have the misogyny working group, which we very much welcome and advocated for. So the first one of those is the issue with violence against women. It's fundamentally contradictory, according to the analysis of violence against women that Scotland uses, to say that some incidents of violence against women are a product of discrimination on the grounds of sex, or animus on the grounds of sex, and some are not. That's just not how we understand violence against women. And so that really does lead to the potential for Equally Safe, our world-leading violence against women strategy, to be undermined by such an approach. The second risk we see is that Scotland is broadly committed to a bunch of human rights frameworks that are really ambitious for women's and girls' equality and rights. And those, including those set out by CEDAW, by the Istanbul Convention, the Council of Europe instrument on violence against women, are crystal clear that the presumption should be against gender-neutral laws which protect men and women in exactly the same way. And they are strongly of the view that if you have this symmetrical approach to incidents of violence against women, that is likely to harm women, and that states should really review their practice in that respect. So in the absence of particular purpose for the sex aggravation or sex-based stirring up offence, we started to consider whether those two things would just be very harmful. And that leads on to the third thing, in our view, as a risk, which is legislative and policy inertia. Sometimes when we have something, even if it's not an appropriate solution or a relevant solution, even if it won't do anything for women but symbolise a justice that remains functionally out of reach, then that can be satisfying. And particularly when we're dealing with something as complicated as hate crime and women's equality and rights. But I thought Joanne Lamont said something very wise and prudent in the debate on this issue. She said, we should recognise the damage that is done if rights appear to exist but are not enforceable. And that is so often the case when we look at misogynistic harassment, public sexual harassment, and online harassment. So I think the final risk is that the baseline position, and this is what the evidence has told us from our review of how this is currently operating around the world, is that hate crime and hate speech are very poorly understood in the context of women. Hate crime is really understood as something which is targeted at minority populations, and it's understood when it comes to race, religion and belief, sexual orientation. It is not understood when it comes to women. And we think that rushing to legislate in a way that hasn't met women's needs in other jurisdictions runs the risk of entrenching that misunderstanding further in criminal justice bodies, in public understanding, and also in women's perception of what the state will or will not tolerate for them and their lives. And symbolism cuts both ways.
I thank Emma for that very comprehensive answer. I see that Dr. Marcia Scott would like to come in for a start, but perhaps first I could go to Susan Smith to get her view and then bring in Marcia and then go to my second and last question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think fundamentally the first point is to say that we believe that as long as there is a statutory aggravation model, women need to be protected, and that can be done by adding sex. In the conversations that we've had, there's obviously an issue that has surrounded a lot of women recently, and in the conversations around transgender identity and women's sex-based rights. And it has largely been felt that if there's no mirror aggravation for sex, women are being left exposed. And I think we have seen that in the way conversations have gone, that things that women have said have been considered hateful and reported in some instances as hate crimes, but there is no equivalent protection. And I think that's very important in terms of the contested nature at the moment of what constitutes hate. And that is a very big conversation. And I mean, I don't want to get stuck on stickers, but it is pertinent there. I'm not sure what the evidence is that a standalone misogynistic offence would mitigate the harms that or reduce the harms that have been identified. And the simple fact is that this conversation has been going on for a very, very long time. The need for this was first identified 17 years ago. 12 years ago, people were giving the same evidence at committee from the same organisations, and nothing has moved on. And one thing that even if this is not a perfect solution, it gets things started, it gets the ball rolling, and it may very well be that a standalone group, that a working group could come up with something far better, but there is a genuine risk that we will be here in another 12 years and nothing has been proposed, and or the proposal is actually not workable. And I note that Lord Bracadell didn't think there were any gaps, actually, in terms of offences that needed to be covered. And I think a lot of the objections that people have to the aggravation model are objections generally to the hate crime as an aggravation model. One of the things that keeps coming back around is about data and training. At the moment, there really is not the facility or the capacity to collect this. There isn't the will to collect that. And I would point out that in the Nottingham trial that started in 2016, they listed misogyny as a hate crime, and they did identify that there are issues around understanding of hate crime. Another issue was around the definition of misogyny, that was felt to be elitist and academic. It was poorly understood, and a lot of the women interviewed as part of the research felt that something clearer would have been more appropriate. So I think terminology is critical there, and I think sex is something that is understandable, that can be rolled out. You can look at sexist abuse. The other thing that came through from the Nottingham trial very clearly was that there was pretty universal levels of support. And even though perhaps it could have been better publicised and there did need to be better education and multi-agency approach around it, the victims felt as though they had had better support from the police, that some of the motivating factors would be more clearly understood. And I do note that in previous panels, witnesses have talked about the need for education and the need for training. And I think that sometimes that goes along with starting the ball rolling on a law like this. That at the moment, I know that Engender have picked up the lack of policies around sexist bullying in school, but that is in place for other forms of bullying. So I think all this needs to be considered within a suite of legislation. And I do understand the issue around the domestic abuse aggravator. A lot of, we try to consult as widely as we possibly can. We have a lot of people in our network from various organisations, and unfortunately, situation being what it is, a lot of people are very nervous about putting their name to anything, although I do have some testimony from people within the domestic violence sector about approaches at the moment. And they, the women we consult with really feel that there needs to be consultation, and that heed needs to be paid to women's voices, to ordinary women's voices. But I do also agree that some people felt that this ignores some of the wider harms to women. So I do understand that, and I think that that can potentially be covered under a working group that might look more broadly at things. But one of the most compelling arguments for us, fed back to us, came from one of the networks who deal with abuse survivors, and they felt that they have not been consulted. They said that they, quote, read, "We are shocked that given the prevalence of violence against women, and in the time of the Me Too movement and the Rapist Is You movement, we are still being denied the protections we so vitally need. We feel leaving us out will create a hierarchy of oppression, with us at the bottom and as the only oppressed group not included. It will also go against CEDAW. When gender identity is included but not sex, it puts our lives at risk by limiting our access to female-only safe spaces." And they also went on to say they want guaranteed protection now, not possibly protection in months or years that may never come to fruition. And I think that knowing that hate crime is on the cards, that is something that the Scottish Government wants to legislate on, it's very important not to ignore women. And I think the other thing that is very important is that this is a decision for MSPs. I concur with the Faculty of Advocates on that this is one for elected representatives, and it was something that came up in the last debate on this bill. Very strongly, a number of, especially women MSPs, really wanted to be able to discuss this. So I think that if it's left out of the bill at this stage, MSPs have been denied that opportunity to explore that, and I think it's of vital importance that this goes back to our elected representatives rather than a ministerial selected working group.
Well, I thank Susan for that very long, comprehensive answer. I would just caution witnesses, every colleague has got their own questions they want to ask, but thank you very much for that contribution. Could I ask my second question and go back to Dr. Marcia Scott, then Emma Rich, and then Susan Smith, and Dr. Marcia Scott and Emma Rich, please raise the supplementary that they had indicated they wished to at that point. My second question is, looking at this working group on misogynistic harassment, what involvement have each of you had thus far, and would you expect to be involved in the workings of this working group to be set up? So first, Dr. Marcia Scott, then Emma Rich, and then Susan Smith, please.
We haven't had any involvement. As far as I know, nothing really has gone forward. There has certainly been discussion in roundtables and as part of the consultation process on the original consultation. We very much supported a working group, and we are keen to see it go forward and would be happy to participate in it when and if it gets set up. I will just say quickly that my supplementary question was, I had meant to mention, I think a really significant danger of the aggravation of adding a sex aggravation, which is that our experience, and I suppose there's no evidence that it will work, and we have really strong concerns that as a result of adding it, it will be another tool for perpetrators of domestic abuse to use in their abuse of women. We are very, very familiar with perpetrators accusing women of abusing them as part of their controlling of women. And, we spend an enormous amount of time gathering evidence and sharing evidence about the importance of not arresting a woman when she calls the police for help because the perpetrator has accused her of being the abuser. And there's libraries of evidence about how that goes on. We absolutely can see, and we have 36 services around Scotland, and we heard a really consensus opinion that perpetrators would use this aggravation. And we are strongly, very concerned, at the possibility that this will happen, and also at the enormous amount of energy that would have to go into the system if we were to even have a chance of preventing that from happening, should this be added. That's me.
Thanks for that. Thanks, Marcia. Emma, and then Susan, please.
Thank you. Yes, no, similar answer to Marcia on the misogyny working group. We advocated for it. We're very keen to see its work go forward, and we'd be pleased to engage with it. I think we haven't had any more detailed conversations than that with Scottish Government, except I think we've asked them several times, what's happening with it, and look forward to the Cabinet Secretary's announcement later. In terms of my follow-on point, I was hoping to speak very briefly about data, and I think the Nottinghamshire example is a really good detail on why some of this stuff really just won't work. And I think the Nottinghamshire example was a very favourable pilot of a hate crime approach. Obviously, they weren't empowered to change the law, but they treated misogynistic street harassment as being important and encouraged women to report. And in the space of 2 years, with a population of around 1 million people, they had 174 reports, only one of which led to a prosecution, and only 73 of which were categorized as crimes. So I think what the Nottinghamshire example tells us is that hate crime is not a concept that tracks easily across to women's experience of harassment. But even when the police make good faith efforts, when they're trained by expert women's organisations, that still isn't enough to counteract the prevailing understanding of hate crime. And we've seen that in international jurisdictions as well. In over 20 years, New Jersey has operated hate crime law, and in that time they have seen 18 reports of sex-based hate crime against a comparative 6,810 for race-based hate crime. So what we're seeing is that this just isn't a model or a concept that really does anything to address gender-based violence, women's violence against women, and so we need different approaches, and that's why we're so pleased to see the Misogyny Working Group going ahead.
Thanks, Emma. And Susan?
No, we haven't had any interaction at all on that. I would just say I know we've raised concerns with the delegated powers about the committee, that the fact that there was a piece in there saying that there might be a modification of adding interpretive powers relating to the characteristic of sex. And we weren't entirely sure what that meant, and we wanted to be clear that it couldn't be changed if it were added. But we did also note that it does talk about a different provision for different purposes. So I don't know if that is something that potentially could mitigate some of the concerns that have been raised and that potentially the committee could look at. I think there is and I know that concerns about the domestic abuse being used against victims is actually something that has been raised within the domestic abuse consultation as well. So but that has not prevented the court approach being preferred within that bill, even though that was raised as a potential issue. And I think that as far as the data issues are concerned, that is something that a lot of people have raised in various committees, that they feel there's underreporting. So perhaps that's a problem with hate crime per se, rather than just one characteristic.
Well, thanks, Susan. Indeed, we have been looking at the issue of reporting as well, but I would like to thank all witnesses for their responses, and back to you, convener.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. And I'm going to ask Bill Kidd to pick up the questioning from here, please. Bill.
Thank you, convener. A lot of you've covered a great deal here, actually, and it's been very helpful. Could I just ask how the panel might see a separate offence of misogynistic harassment working, and how that would benefit taking cases forward?
Can you direct your question to a particular witness?
Oh, I
first
do
and know
apologise.
what order to go?
Right.
Maybe Emma first.
Yeah, I was thinking Emma would probably be most likely in that. Yes, please, Emma.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks for that question. I mean, I think we certainly don't want to anticipate the work of the Misogyny Working Group too much, but I think what we'd hoped they would do is first of all look at the evidence base, and we think there is some data out there which suggests that women are having an almost universal experience of public sexual harassment, but we're also seeing a significant increase in online harassment. And when we were talking to male MSPs about hate crime and misogyny, we really got a very strong acknowledgement back that they saw the experience of their female colleagues as being really significant, that on social media and elsewhere there were threats and very misogynistic expressions towards female parliamentarians, which were very different from their own experience. I think we're also increasingly seeing very, very serious links between misogyny and terrorism. And some of those have been picked up by bodies that are expert and looking at terrorism. We've seen some murders in 2014 occur, and some tracking of that work being done since that murder in Santa Barbara in 2014, which has identified that 90 murders and significant injuries are attributable to what is known as incel ideologies. which is a subsection of misogyny. And we've just seen this year federal authorities in Canada bringing terrorism charges against a young man who murdered and injured women in a machete attack, which they also attributed to this incel ideology. So there's some real questions about whether we need to look at misogyny in the context of securitization, as well as what might be seen as, much lesser offences relating to police harassment. And I think the question of stirring up or hate speech is also vitally important to consider. The Council of Europe found in their analysis that despite the availability of civil, criminal or administrative penalties in member states, there are not many court cases dealing with sexist hate speech. And so we would hope that the Misogyny Working Group would look at the breadth of evidence across all of these distinct experiences, consider where there are gaps in the law, and then act to fill those gaps. So this would be an evidence-based approach that would nonetheless tackle and challenge the most serious forms of misogyny that women are facing as a constraint on their lives and their liberty.
Thanks very much for that, Emma. That's very, very helpful indeed. I think that one of the worries often is that when a characteristic is included in such a large bill, that it may turn out to be very little more than symbolic, in terms of it's got to be included as well. So that's something that I think is important that is covered in the manner in which you've said there. So thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Can I just invite either Marcia or Susan to address the question as well if they want to? There's no obligation to. Marcia's indicating that she'd like to come in. So Marcia first, please.
Yes, I would just like to add that I absolutely mean this sincerely. I'm not buttering up the committee. I think that if any body were capable of creating a misogyny offense that was nuanced and sophisticated enough to make a difference to the women and girls of Scotland, then it is the Scottish Parliament. And the reason I say that is that I was deeply involved, as you all will know, in the development of the domestic abuse bill, which has now been held up as the world's gold standard domestic abuse legislation. And the reason I believe firmly, or one of the reasons that it acquired that status, is because of the collaborative work between victims' organizations like Scottish Women's Aid and officials in the government and justice working together to actually understand survivors' experiences of coercive control and to find a way to embed those in a very complex piece of legislation that reflects a very complex social phenomenon. Now, I don't know exactly what a misogyny bill offense should look like, and I don't think anybody who says that they do know, I think is wrong. But I do think that we have an opportunity here, again, to lead the world, and that we've already got a bit of practice at doing something really difficult in a way that actually takes us all a step forward. And so I know it may sound slightly aspirational, but I do think that we can either be back here 10 years from now, or we can take a uncertain but bold step forward.
Okay, thank you. And I think Susan Smith wants to come in briefly on this, if you would, please, Susan.
Yeah, sorry. I think it's perfectly reasonable to have a working group to consider wider and deeper harms, because misogyny is endemic and it is ignored. And that's part of the problem at the moment, that it is ignored. And one of the issues around finding patterns is you can disrupt patterns more easily and earlier. So it may not be perfect at the moment, but it could be a start in the interim. And I think the symbolism has been mentioned. And I think if you are looking at symbolism, you also have to consider the symbolic impact of saying that at this point, even though we know there is an epidemic of violence against women, harassment of women, that you are content as a parliament or as a country to push that off until an unspecified and possibly remote later date.
Okay, thank you. I have one very specific supplementary question, if I may, to Emma Rich on the basis of what she just told the committee. And Emma, I wonder if I could just put to you what Lord Brackadale told the committee on the 27th of October and invite you to respond to it in terms. And what Lord Brackadale said was that it seemed to him that there was no gap in the law that required to be filled by an offence of misogynistic harassment. And also, he went on to say that it's difficult to pin down a precise definition of misogyny laws because different groups had different understandings of what the term means. So I wonder, Emma, if you just wanted to respond very quickly, but specifically to those observations from Lord Brackadale.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, when Lord Brackadale met with Dr. Scott and I, he was certainly looking for evidence of gaps in the law, and we were obliged to tell him that we didn't know there had been no systematic evaluation of that. I'm not sure that Lord Brackadale has actually undertaken that systematic evaluation, and I think that is something for the Misogyny Working Group to pick up as a matter of urgency. I did read his evidence to the committee, and certainly I did not hear him speak about the potential links between misogyny and terrorism, specific substrands of misogyny, public street harassment. I think he focused his remarks to you on the subject of online misogyny. I would potentially also dispute, with the dewest regard to Lord Brackadale, the extent to which the existing law is actually working for women. And so we do see epidemic levels of online harassment that are having a material impact on women's well-being and lives. We see women experiencing anxiety, sleepless nights, deciding not to enter into technology-related professions, choosing different subjects to study at school, not availing themselves of leisure opportunities that are open to them, deciding to go to different places and do different things because of the fear of online attack and harassment. And so if the law is considered to cover those areas of life, I'm not sure why then it's not working for women. And I think that does need to be something which the Misogyny Working Group looks at with some degree of urgency.
Thank you. I think all of the members of the committee share that sense of urgency, and we'll be putting questions about the timing of this to the Cabinet Secretary, among many other issues later on this morning. But thank you for that, Emma. I'm going to move now to Liam Kerr, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I have three quick questions on the definitions, particularly in part 3, because they've been raised in submissions. What I'll do is direct each question to a specific panellist, but obviously if anyone else wants to come in and comment, we can do that. So the first question I'll direct to Susan Smith, because you have a specific section in your submission on transgender identity. Now, I asked the Cabinet Secretary in a parliamentary question some time ago how gender identity was defined, and I got what I felt was a slightly circular answer, and I didn't really understand it. So since you've specifically referred to it in your submission, Susan Smith, would you mind explaining your thoughts on the definition of transgender identity which is used in this bill?
I think one of the main concerns and concentrate on that is probably the inclusion in here of cross-dressing. And I, in prepping for this, I came across an interesting FOI, which has just actually come out on correspondence between Equality Network and the government on what the definition was. And this says, a man who is not a trans woman but wears a dress for a drag performance or a trip to the Rocky Horror Picture Show, or because he feels an emotional need to cross-dress occasionally. Now, there are several points in it. One is that this is evidently there to protect men, because it's very hard to think of any circumstance where a woman might be considered a cross-dresser. It's also actually setting up a scenario whereby you may have a man and a woman wearing the same costume, going to a Rocky Horror Picture Show, and the man is a victim of a crime, and that is a hate crime, but the woman potentially will be find herself when the case goes to court, being asked, what were you wearing? So there is a bizarre and quite frankly sexist face to that. And then you move on to the idea that why are you protecting one set of people for what is essentially sartorial choice and not others? I mean, there is plenty of examples of people being attacked for what they're wearing, goths, people with facial tattoos, body piercings, wrong football strip, wrong school uniform. So why is one dress sense being protected but not another? I think the rationale given was that it might be because they are assumed to be trans, but I think that should be captured anyway. If somebody is assumed to have a protected characteristic, they should have the protection of this law anyway. So I don't really think that's an excuse. The other part about this is that at the other extreme, so at one end it's dress sense, at the other extreme it can be a paraphilia. It is listed as such in the DSM. It sometimes is accompanied by a crossover with other indicators for offences, and so you get this quite bizarre situation where something that may be done for purposes of arousal is being protected under a hate crime law. And we get then to Glasgow Life's policy last year, which was quite an extraordinary situation whereby they were openly advocating that cross-dressers who, as we've seen, Equality Network say might be just dressed up to go to a party or a Rocky Horror Picture Show event, could access the female changing rooms of Glasgow Life facilities. The policy stated that if women objected to this, and I think we can all see quite good reasons why women might object to this, it should be explained to them, and if they continued to object, a hate crime report could be filed. So I think that this can be used, it's quite obvious how this can be used and how it was proposed this could be used as a bit of a weapon against women. One of the other issues is the different sex.
Susan, forgive me interrupting. Yeah. I'm just aware of our time. So if I might move on to my next question, which is to Emma Rich, and perhaps if there's something to say on the back of that, you could indicate and come back in. But Emma Rich, I'd like to throw, I think there was an interesting issue raised in that, which in the course of responding to this question, I think you may also look to respond to Susan Smith's answer there. I asked the Cabinet Secretary in another parliamentary question some time ago where I could find the definition of a non-binary person and a person who cross-dresses, which is what the bill refers to. And the Cabinet Secretary's answer was basically, and I'm paraphrasing, anyone can look it up, it's a public document, but he basically said it was unnecessary. He used the word, it was not necessary to define these. Do you have a comment on that? Do you think that's sufficient? Do you think that's a fair answer? Or do you think actually there should be a separate definition, Emma Rich?
I mean, I can't speak for the Cabinet Secretary. What I can say is that when there was, within the context of the initial consultation on the Gender Recognition Act by Scottish Government, a suggestion that non-binary in some way be added to the Equality Act, Engender's view was that that needed very careful scoping out by lawyers who worked on women's equality and rights. We're very concerned that women's protection from sex discrimination not be confused by any interjection around other protected characteristics. But on the definition itself, I think that's a matter for my colleagues who work in LGBT rights organisations. Engender works around the issues of women's equality and rights, and I will stay in our lane, if I may.
Of course, and if no one else wants to comment on that, I'll put a final question to Dr. Scott. Again, similar point on definitions, and it's just in section 14.6b, we have talk of persons of a different sex. Now that differs from the definition of a reference to sexual orientation in the Offences Aggravated by Prejudice Act, which talks of the opposite sex. Now, I will put this to the Cabinet Secretary later because I don't quite understand why a different term has been used, but do you take a view on the use of a different sex as opposed to the opposite sex? Or in your view, Dr. Scott, is this not a significant issue?
I think I'd have to say either all of the implications of all of this are going completely over my head, or it's not a significant issue. Those are my two choices at the moment.
A very fair answer, Dr. Scott. And unless Emma or Susan wish to come in on that, I shall hand back to the convener.
Thank you very much. Liam, I'd like to ask a general question about the stirring up offences, please. And again, I'm going to direct this question to Emma Rich first, but then to Marcia and to Susan. And the question is just to invite you, Emma, whether you have any reflections you'd like to share with the committee about the way in which the bill tackles stirring up offences. I heard you say to Liam Kerr just now that you want to stay in your lane, so it may be that you don't want to say anything very much about this. That's completely up to you. But do you have any reflections about the way in which the bill tackles the stirring up offences, in particular perhaps about the relationship between tackling hate crime and protecting fundamental rights such as privacy and freedom of expression? Emma.
I mean, I think we have a general interest, as all citizens do, in seeing stirring up offences in Part 2 balance the need to protect minoritized groups from hate with the need for persons, especially those from marginalised groups, to articulate their views, including feminist speech. We've all defended organisations that advocate for equality and rights, causes that are sometimes unfashionable. Sometimes there is offence caused to some groups. And it's something we shouldn't criminalise or threaten with a form of veiled threat of criminality. We have suggested in our written evidence that the bill be amended to replace the current freedom of expression provisions with a more generalist freedom of expression protection that isn't absolute but applies equally to all characteristics. I think that would be enabling. I think there is also potentially a job of work for government to do to communicate the purpose of this part of the bill to citizens of Scotland. I think witnesses have talked about the language of the bill being clear, but obviously normal people don't need to memorise the text of legal restrictions. And so what the public understands by the bill, I think, will be quite critical. And I think I'd probably leave my comments there.
Thank you very much, Emma. Could I ask the same question to Marcia Scott, please?
I don't think I really have anything to add. I think that we are so far from having a language, even in this setting, in which we can talk about many of these issues with shared assumptions and definitions, then I think that it's a long path to get to a place where the general public moves in that same direction and actually has a law that is useful in people's everyday lives. And I think beyond that, it is about finding a way to get there rather than saying that we know how to do it right now.
Okay, thank you. And
really
thank you, Dr. Scotland. Can I address the same question to Susan Smith, please?
I think we would prefer to see Part 2 almost in its entirety dropped, because it's hugely complicated to try and untangle some of the issues there. We see the case for a separate bespoke solution for racial hatred, because racism is and continues to be an animated force, and it's differentiated by a degree of political organisation. But we would say that within some of the other categories, there's a contested nature of hate, and that some of the things, and we've certainly had accusations levelled at us for all kinds of reasons, simply for talking about sex and biology. And the problem is that when that is given a degree of legitimacy by people, including MPs, MSPs, and only this week we saw Amnesty Ireland make a quite extraordinary comment about a group in Ireland, and they said that they objected to the fact they were defending biology and said that they should have no legitimate political representation. And in fact, the granddaughter of John McBride, who won the Nobel Prize and was one of the founders of Amnesty, came in at that point and heavily criticised them and said this was contrary to what Amnesty was supposed to do. But I think this shows just how difficult it can be when people start throwing out accusations of hate, and especially if those people are perceived to have an authority. We think there will be a chilling effect. There has been a chilling effect already. Certainly, it certainly doesn't have to come to trial, and I am aware, and I take on board previous comments that if standards of evidence are high, you might not end up with a conviction, but that isn't actually always the main issue. It's often way before people get to trial. There have been cases where women have been questioned away from young children, sometimes sick children. In fact, the first one, there was a trial last year in England of transphobic hatred that was actually against a transsexual person. Miranda Yardley, who was on trial, described it as 10 months of hell. And I think the stirring up part of this bill has the potential to make life very, very much harder for a number of people, and to use this law as a weapon. And I would also say one thing that I think has not been raised, and it's not particularly in our lane, but it is something that came through in some of our consultation, was I know you're giving consideration to learning difficulties within the disability section. There have been cases where people with Asperger's have made comments. There was a case last year in North Wales, and they were fined for a hate crime. And disability charities said that sometimes people with Asperger's just make a blunt comment and they don't really understand that. So I would caution, when we're talking about inflammatory language, stirring up hatred, abuse, I think we have to be extremely careful that you're not opening the door, and that there is cover for all categories, which includes things like antipathy, dislike and ridicule, and that we're not potentially, in introducing this law, actually introducing a new blasphemy law and limiting freedoms, because freedoms are so important.
Thank you very much for those views, all of which the committee will take on board. We have about 8 minutes left for this session, and we have two other members who want to come in and ask questions, at least two other members. John Finney first, and then Rona, but John Finney wants to take up the questioning next, please. John.
Thank you very much indeed, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'll be very brief, Convener. As you know, I ask about the use of statutory aggravations as the core method of prosecuting hate crime in Scotland. Do the panel have views on that? And very briefly, this is consolidating legislation, and without revisiting some of the earlier discussion, is there anything we're missing out on here, please? First to Dr. Scott, please, and then to Ms. Rich, and then Ms. Smith.
John, I don't think I really understand your question.
Okay, sorry. Are you content with the statutory aggravating model continuing as a form of prosecution? And are there any categories that we should be looking at to include statutory aggravator?
You mean in addition to the ones that have been raised already?
Yes.
I suppose I'll say two things. The first thing is that it does seem clear to me that the aggravation model is not terribly effective, and I have some concerns, and this is probably for another day, about the one that we included in the domestic abuse bill. Well, I was the one who wrote it, of course not. But so I think the aggravations as a tool, I have big questions about how effective they are in actually creating community change. And secondly, I think I only have an opinion about whether we add sex or not. I can't think of another area that I would want to throw in.
Okay, thank you very much. Perhaps to Ms. Smith next, please.
I think there clearly are issues and that a lot of people have raised. One thing that I think the committee might consider that was raised in previous sessions is perhaps whether you have these categories or whether you just consider any crime that can be proven to be motivated by prejudice or hatred. But yeah, broadly, I think there are a lot of issues with it.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And finally, Ms. Rich, please.
Thank you. I mean, I think one point I would perhaps want to highlight is that I've heard a number of witnesses talk about the inclusion of sex as if it's a kind of matter of fairness or equality. And I think that certainly I would want to correct perhaps the misapprehension that equality involves treating all protected groups the same. In fact, even in our kind of standout banner equality legislation, the Equality Act, protected characteristics and protected groups are not all treated the same. And there are different provisions within that act relating to different groups, contingent on the experiences that they have. So the equal pay elements, for example, relate to sex, but not to other protected characteristics. There are particular protections for pregnancy and maternity and for disabled people that don't apply to other groups. And so I would urge the committee to kind of resist the tempting narrative that because of equality reasons, sex should be included within this bill. A real equality approach, I think, as we've described, would be to treat women and to treat misogynistic harassment in the way that the evidence suggests that it should be treated. And so that's what we're advocating for. In terms of statutory aggravations, I don't have any further comment. I think they're demonstrably not working for women in other jurisdictions around the world. And I note that they haven't been tried and tested in a lot of places because of this, as per Professors Leverick and Chalmers' really excellent paper to this committee. And so I think I would urge you to align perhaps with the other jurisdictions who've looked at this, seen how ineffective it would be for women, and gone in a different, and as Marcia Scott described it, bold and ambitious direction.
Okay, thank you all very much. Thank you, Camilla.
Thank you. Did Susan Smith want to come in on that or not? She did. I'm so sorry. I was distracted. So sorry, it's my mistake. My mistake. Rona Mackay, would you like to wrap up the questioning for this panel, please? Thank you.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, panel. Can I ask, in addition to legislation, what more do you think needs to be done to support victims and tackle crime that targets women? I'm thinking in terms of engagement with organisations such as yourself, resourcing support services, and seeking to change attitudes generally. And if you could maybe just say how and if we are actually progressing and changing those societal attitudes, that would be great, please. If I go to Marcia first, and then Emma, then Susan, please.
Thanks for that question, Rona. I think it really is the elephant in the room often with our conversations. And I think that the larger picture, obviously we all know that legislation is not a panacea, never a silver bullet, if you will. And it only is as effective as the enabling environment it's in. And I think the domestic abuse bill is a really good example of that. I would say that that it's about gender mainstreaming. To steal Bill Clinton's tell you how old I am. Bill Clinton's phrase about is the economy stupid? I would say it's the gender mainstreaming stupid. We have still so many indicators that that officials, that public sector professionals, across the whole gamut of Scotland don't understand about gender and inequality and women's inequality. And I think dislodging gender stereotypes, challenging them, holding ourselves and officials accountable for robust and competent equality impact assessments. Those are the kinds of things that will help create an enabling landscape that should we have an effective misogyny law, would allow Scotland to actually leap forward. But none of these by themselves, I think, are going to affect change.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Emma, could I ask your opinion, please?
Absolutely, and I agree with everything Marsha said. I suppose I would add to that that we've been talking about this issue of hate crime and women for about 5 years now, and we've talked a lot to women and women's organisations, and I know the Scottish Women's Convention has done a programme of engagement on this with women right across Scotland. And one of the messages that constantly comes back is we don't think that the people who are making decisions, we don't think that the criminal justice system understands the extent and the level of sexism that women face in every aspect of their lives. And so some of this feels like tinkering around the edges rather than engaging with the core issue. I think Marsha is quite right to point at gender mainstreaming, and we have the public sector equality duty in Scotland that is really supposed to be transforming women's lives, and I think it's not doing that at the moment, and that's something for parliamentarians to keep an eye on into the next session. I think I am heartened by the moves to incorporate CEDAW into Scots law, and I think having that minimum standard of women's rights will be profoundly transformational if Scotland can make that work. And I would urge parliamentarians to keep their eye on that too as we move into future parliaments. I think Scotland can be hugely ambitious when it comes to tackling egregious forms of violence against women and sexism. And we've seen that with the Domestic Abuse Act. And it was that really gave Engender and other national women's organisations hope that we could do something similarly transformational with misogyny offences. We could take bold steps that other nations have yet failed to take and really grasp the nettle of where harassment of women is at. Thanks.
Thank you. Susan, can I ask your view, please?
Yeah, clearly there needs to be multi-agency approaches and more needs to be done on changing attitudes. And I think that one thing that, and we absolutely agree that CEDAW needs to be incorporated and needs to be at the heart of everything that is done in government. But one thing I would say is when we talk about things like the public sector equality duty, when we talk about equality legislation, we have to be able to talk about women as a sex class. And unfortunately, we are currently being prevented from doing that, and messages are coming from the top which are making it extremely difficult, making women's lives extremely difficult. And one of the biggest, at the moment, one of the biggest reasons women get attacked online is for standing up for their sex-based rights, and we are not seeing the support either from government or indeed from the national women's organisations to enable that conversation to take place, and that needs to change.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, convener. That's me.
Thank you very much, Rona. And could I just thank Emma Rich, Susan Smith and Dr. Marsha Scott for their evidence this morning. It's been really helpful, really genuinely helpful to all of the members of the committee to hear what you've had to share with us this morning. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your patience and forbearance earlier while we were trying to sort out our technical glitches. I'm very grateful. I'm going to suspend just for 2 minutes to enable a changeover of witnesses, and we'll resume at 11:15. And I'd like to welcome our second panel today. We have in front of us Hamza Youssef, MSP, the Cabinet Secretary for Justice. And with him in person are two of his officials, Bill Brash and Philip Lamont. And online, I think we're joined also by four further officials from the Scottish Government, Joe Gillis, Rachel Wilson, Claire McKinley and Patrick Down. You're all very welcome. As usual, Cabinet Secretary, we will direct all of our questions to you, but if you want to bring in your officials at any point, then I'll leave that to you. And I understand you want to make a very short opening statement.
Very brief one. Thank you very much. Convener, can I thank the committee for inviting me to give evidence for a second time on the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Bill. I've heard with interest the evidence presented to the committee over the past 4 weeks. I remain committed to taking this opportunity to shape legislation so that it's fit for the 21st century and most importantly, that it affords sufficient protection for those that need it. It's clear that many of the committee's witnesses focused on what the bill will mean for their continued right to free expression, be that through religious, artistic, cultural practices, public debate, or indeed the simple expression of opinions or beliefs. It's also clear that the vast majority of witnesses welcome the changes I outlined in Parliament in September, which will make the intent to stir up hatred an essential part of the new stirring up of hatred offences. But clearly also a number of witnesses presented concerns. Convener, I've always said that I will listen to all voices engaged in this debate. I have listened and watched carefully the evidence presented. And in that regard, let me give just a couple of reflections on that evidence. In terms of Section 4, the performance of plays, the Section 4 of the bill clearly sets out when directors and presenters of plays can be held criminally liable where a performer commits an offence of stirring up hatred. I recognise the concerns expressed by the performing arts community that the provision appears to single them out and the anxiety which that has caused. The Public Order Act 1986 does include similar provisions, and it was on that basis that it was included in the bill. However, the evidence this committee heard has led me to conclude that Section 4 can be removed from the bill. We also accept that neglect on the part of a director or presenter of a play is too low a threshold for criminal sanction in this case. You have heard evidence from, amongst others, the Law Society, the Faculty of Advocates, Dr. Andrew Tickell, about general criminal law rules regarding criminal liability of those who aid, abet, counsel, procure, or incite the commission of a criminal offence. So I will therefore be seeking to remove Section 4 from the bill and instead look to apply existing rules on aiding and abetting an offence. On Section 11, in terms of freedom of expression of religion, that is the second issue I just wanted to touch upon. Many witnesses, including those from faith groups, have indicated that the current provision in Section 11 of the bill should be more closely aligned with the equivalent provision in England and Wales under the 1986 Act. We will therefore propose amendments to the provision so it covers the absence of religious belief and also to include references to clarify that mere expressions of antipathy, dislike, ridicule and insult are not on their own criminal behaviour. I'm committed to working with Parliament to ensure hate crime law is effective while protecting freedom of expression, and I will continue to reflect on other areas in the bill at Stage 1 as Stage 1 reaches its conclusion. Very finally, Convener, I know that before my appearance today the committee took evidence from a range of women's organisations. I'm very keen that we make progress on the working group that will advise us in relation to a potential standalone offence of misogynistic harassment and the use of the power to add sex as a characteristic to the hate crime scheme. I'm able to announce this morning that the working group will be chaired by Baroness Helena Kennedy. Baroness Kennedy has extensive experience and knowledge in relation to women and the legal system. She will provide a strong, independent perspective for our important work in this area. I have had an initial discussion with Baroness Kennedy. She is hugely enthusiastic and ready to go in relation to this important work. I'll be discussing further with her a detailed remit, membership and timescales for the group so that this vital work can move at pace. I'm delighted to have someone of Baroness Kennedy's stature and integrity leading this important piece of work. And I'm happy to conclude there and take any questions the committee may have.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, for those opening remarks. As you noted in them, the amendments that you proposed and announced in Parliament in September to the stirring up offences have been welcomed by most, although not by all, of our witnesses. But the majority of our witnesses have told us that in addition, further amendments to this part of the bill, that's to say part 2 of the bill, the part dealing with stirring up, will be required. And I'd like to ask you some detailed questions about 2 of those suggestions. Many witnesses have called for insulting to be removed from the bill. And having heard the evidence we've been given, what are your current thoughts about this?
Well, thank you, Convener. I didn't get to listen to that session actually, but I managed to read the transcript afterwards, and I am continuing to pay close attention. I did, when I first came to committee at the very first session, say that I thought it was exceptionally important that we listen to all views, and of course we give weight to all views, but I did think it's important to give additional weight to those who are often the victims of a particular hate crime. And when it comes to the racial stirring up offence, I do think there's a justification for treating the racial stirring up offence differently to the other offences. Now that does go counter to, you're absolutely right, from a legal purist point of view, it goes against legal purity. I accept that. It potentially causes a hierarchy, some would suggest, and I don't think that's an unfair suggestion. But I do think there's a justifiable case for treating race differently. We know that 2/3 of all hate crime in Scotland relate to race. We know that there's no denying of the prevalence of racial crime in Scotland, let alone in other parts of the UK. So what I would say is, for me, if we removed insulting, it would mean that Scotland would then be the only legal jurisdiction in the UK that would not have insulting as part of the legal threshold. So in England and Wales, insulting continues to be part of the legal threshold when it comes up to stirring up of racial offences. In Northern Ireland, insulting is still retained as well. So Scotland would have at least the perception of the weakest racial stirring up offence at the same time when racial offences make up 2/3 of all hate crimes. And you're right, I did listen to the evidence that there was many people, as you say, particularly from the legal fraternity, I think that raised some concerns. But on the flip side of that, when I talk about giving weight to those most affected, I thought it was significant and important to note that Danny Boyle from BEMIS, Dr Jenny Galbraith from the Commission of Racial Equality and Rights, Kevin Kane from YouthLink Scotland, Amy Allard, Dunbar from Intercultural Youth Scotland, that when they gave their evidence, and I won't quote, of course, verbatim, but they, to paraphrase, certainly all supported the retaining of the insulting threshold.
Yes, they did, and you're quite right to record that. Can I put 2 particular pieces of evidence to you on this point and invite you to reflect on them, Cabinet Secretary? And you say that the legal fraternity, I think that's the phrase you use, or legal community, was strong on this point. Of course, Lord Bracadale himself is strong on it. Roddy Dunlop, speaking on behalf of the Faculty of Advocates, is strong on it. But the 2 pieces of evidence I want to put to you are evidence that we obtained from Assistant Chief Constable Ritchie and from Anthony McGeehan from the Crown Office. And this is what ACC Ritchie said of the inclusion of the word insulting in the offence of stirring up racial hatred. It makes it more difficult for the officer to understand what types of behaviour and what circumstances cross the criminal threshold, he said. So the inclusion of this word on the criminal statute book makes the operational function of police officers enforcing this law more difficult. What's your response to that?
So first of all, we always listen to the comments of Police Scotland, because from an operational point, of course, hugely important that we don't make life any more difficult for them. I suppose what I would say to Police Scotland, and of course I'll continue conversation with them, is that the insulting threshold has been in law since 1986, and I haven't to this day, in my role as Cabinet Secretary for Justice, come across officers who've told me that they've found the application of that law challenging or difficult. Now, of course, it's not an exact replication from the 1986 Act, because we've talked about, and I'm sure we'll get into issues such as the dwelling defence and so on and so forth. But as it stands in the 34 years of its operation, I haven't had, I certainly haven't, when I've spoken to Police Scotland, they haven't expressed to me any difficulties that they've encountered from an operational point of view.
I hear what you say about the fact that this word is in the 1986 Act, but we have also been told, as you will know, that just because something is in the Public Order Act 1986 is no reason for putting it in the hate crime bill that's in front of us now. And you've just this morning said that there are going to be even more differences between the 1986 Act and this bill is enacted because you propose to remove the provision in Section 4 of this bill regarding theatres and plays and public performance from this bill, even though it's in the 1986 Act. So the fact that something's in the 1986 Act is not of itself a good reason for putting it in this bill, is it? But let me just also put to you what Anthony McGeehan said from the Crown Office, and what he said from the Crown Office was endorsed, of course, by, or was an echo, rather, of what Lord Brackadale had already told this committee on the 27th of October. And what Mr McGeehan said was, and again I'm quoting from the evidence, the removal of the word insulting would not diminish the ability of the Crown to take appropriate prosecutorial action in relation to those reported offences. Insulting was removed from Section 5 of the Public Order Act, and Lord Brackadale recorded that that did not diminish the capacity of the prosecutors at all to act effectively and appropriately. So if the removal of this word from the statute book would make no material difference to what the Crown can prosecute, why do we want to keep the word there?
So two points to make. I'm not suggesting that because something is in the 1986 Act, it has to be in the Act or the bill that we're bringing forward. What you asked me was a question based on a police officer's evidence. What difference would it make to the operation on the ground? My analysis is that if it hasn't presented an operational problem, despite being an offence and despite being a threshold for nearly 35 years, why does it suddenly present an operational problem now? And that's a question I'm happy to take off board offline with Police Scotland. So it's not a simple case of something being in the 86 Act. It should then be in our bill at all, but it's an operational point. On your second question, I don't disagree with the legal purity of the argument. So I don't disagree with the fact that it may not take away from the Crown's ability to prosecute. I think what I've always said in relation to the question of insulting is at the very least, amongst those who are targeted the most by racial hatred crime, then there's a perception that there would be a weakening or a dilution. And that's not just my words. I will again just quote, if I may, from, for example, Dr. Jenny Galbraith from CREA, the Commission for Racial Equality. We too have significant concerns about that, i.e. the removal of insulting. We agree that its removal would dilute those protections, even outside the legal context. In reality, with regard to people's everyday lived experience, it could have a potential harmful effect on black and minority ethnic communities in Scotland. I thought Danny Boyle from Bemis gave a...
I understand that this perception is held, and I have no doubt, Cabinet Secretary, that it is honestly and genuinely held. But it's an inaccurate perception, isn't it? It's an incorrect perception, because what the prosecutors tell us and what Lord Brackadale tells us is that it would make no material difference to what the Crown is able to prosecute. So yes, that perception is there in the communities that you're referring to, but it is an inaccurate perception, isn't it?
But I'm sure you would also agree with me that public confidence in the law is hugely important. And again, for those who have been afforded a protection under the 1986 Act for the best part of 35 years, if they perceive that the law is being weakened in this regard, and weaker than it is in England and Wales, and weaker than it is in Northern Ireland, that perception alone could be damaging. So I don't disagree with, the legal purity of your argument, that it may not have a material impact in terms of prosecution. But that is not the only factor to be considered. Public perception and confidence in the law is also exceptionally important as well.
It is, but so is the confidence of the police that they know what they're doing when they're enforcing criminal offences, which this Parliament passes.
Agreed, and they have enforced it for, again, nearly 35 years without, as far as I can tell, though I'm happy to take this offline again with police, and I have spoken to them already about this, that there doesn't seem to have been any significant operational issue on the ground in the last 35 years.
Okay, thank you. That's what I wanted to ask about insulting. I want to now move to the word abusive, which appears elsewhere in the bill, as you know. And we've heard evidence on this term too, Cabinet Secretary, that not that it needs to be removed from the bill necessarily, but it does at least need to be defined in the bill, ensuring that it is not, ensuring that it is an objective and not a subjective standard. So What is your position on the notion that the word abusive needs to be defined to ensure that it is objectively understood in the context of this bill?
Well, again, from a Scottish perspective, again, as convener, you know only too well that there has been an offence for the last 10 years of threatening or abusive behaviour. It has been prosecuted again without much challenge in terms of the definition of threatening or abusive behaviour. Certainly none that's come to my attention. You also, in your previous question to me, referenced the Crown, and I note from their evidence on the question about abusive that they said to this committee, I'm paraphrasing slightly, that it was a very familiar concept in Scottish criminal law, which is very well understood. That was also the view from the faculty of advocates as well. So I'm not convinced that there has to be a definition of abusive where there isn't a definition, as you know. Excuse me, the ordinary meaning of the word is therefore taken, and again, I'm not convinced that there is a need for that definition. Remember, there is also a second part to the test, I know, which we're all aware of, particularly for the new offences being intent only. So there is an additional safeguard there when it comes to the threshold of this offence, but I'm not convinced, having listened to the evidence thus far, that there is a need to define abusive.
Would any harm be done by defining abusive in an objective way? So, for example, Tim Hopkins on the 17th of November in oral evidence to us from the Equality Network suggested, in quite strong terms actually, that he thought that abusive must be interpreted in an objective way. And he suggested a way of doing it would be to amend the bill by ensuring that it says that behaviour or material is abusive if a reasonable person would, in all the circumstances of the case, consider it to be abusive. What harm would be done by an amendment to such as that? And if no harm would be done by an amendment such as that, why not do it?
So a couple of things. One, and I should have said this at the very beginning, that we'll continue to, of course, reflect on the evidence that was given, but also any recommendations for amendments that come forward. But it is the law of unintended consequences, because if you have a definition, therefore anything that falls outside of that definition would not be included. And therefore we have to ensure that if we are going to include a definition of abusive, it has to absolutely capture all of the behaviour we want it to capture. That can be challenging. And again, in relation to the word abusive, whereas I see no reason why the ordinary meaning of the word, the dictionary definition, can't be used and isn't well understood. So I'm open-minded to hearing, well, I'll continue to reflect on the evidence, but open-minded if there's any particular amendments that come forward on the word abusive. But as I say, it has not seemed to cause a problem in relation to the 2010 Act, which has been prosecuted thousands of times by our courts in the last 10 years. I'm not sure it would present a problem in this bill.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on to considering the free speech provisions in sections 11 and 12 of the bill, which you already referred to in your opening remarks, Cabinet Secretary, and I think Liam MacArthur wants to pick up the questioning on this, and then after Liam MacArthur, it'll be Liam Kerr.
Yes, thanks very much, Convener, Cabinet Secretary. Good morning. You referred in your opening remarks there, but also in the more detailed evidence you gave earlier last month, that you were open-minded to looking at both a broadening and a deepening of the safeguards in relation to freedom of expression under sections 11 and 12 of this bill. You will have seen, I'm sure, the evidence we've received, which I think it would be maybe fair to say was broadly supportive, although there were some concerns expressed by a number of witnesses about the practicalities of delivering this. And I just wonder whether you'd had an opportunity to reflect on that and what your intentions are at this stage, leading up to stage 2.
So thank Liam MacArthur for the question. So he will have heard obviously my opening remarks. So in terms of deepening the freedom of expression clause around religion, we're happy to do that, and I'll bring forward amendments at stage 2 to that effect. The evidence that the Justice Committee took really demonstrated the challenge that lies therein in terms of widening the freedom of expression clauses, because many different organisations and stakeholders came up with different formulations of freedom of expression clauses that they thought would meet their satisfaction. And that demonstrates the problem that there are many different approaches that could possibly take it could be taken, and they all have their pros and their cons. So the short answer is that we're still reflecting on that. I'm certain that we will make changes to the freedom of expression, or further changes to the freedom of expression clauses, but I couldn't at this stage be able to tell you exactly how that will be formulated.
That's helpful in a sense. I mean, I detect from that there is perhaps a cooling of the idea that, that broadening those protections is likely to form part of the government's thinking in stage 2. I mean, obviously, it's up to members to bring forward amendments, but at this stage, while you're looking to maybe deepen the provisions in relation to religion, you're not minded to go further either in that regard or in relation to the broadening of the protection.
No, I'm not sure what gave Mr. McCarthy that impression. I wouldn't describe it as a cooling off at all. We're still very actively exploring how we may be able to satisfy the concerns of the many stakeholders that wanted further freedom of expression clauses or expanded freedom of expression clauses. I think we've been able to do that with religion because we're able to align it very closely with the English and Welsh provisions. But on the other freedom of expression clauses that are that a number of organisations want, we just have to think a little bit more carefully about how we do it. But definitely, I wouldn't describe it as a cooling off of the idea. That's still very much something we're actively exploring.
Okay, if I could move on to section 4, and there was a brief exchange earlier in relation to some of the concerns that have been raised with us around the implications of this bill for plays and other public performances in theatres. We've certainly been told by relevant witnesses that they don't believe there's any need for a separate provision in this bill in that regard. I was just wondering whether you'd agree that section 4 could safely be omitted on the basis of what the committee's been told.
So I'm not sure if Liam McCarthy was able to hear my opening remarks or not, but yes, I indicated in my opening remarks that we will be bringing forward amendments at stage 2 to remove part 4 of the bill, having reflected on the evidence. Section 4. Yes, not part 4. Thank you. Part 2, section 4 of the bill. We definitely don't want to get rid of part 4 of the bill. That's staying for sure. So section 4 of the bill, to omit and to remove that. It is also a policy choice to do so. You may remember from my very first evidence session in front of committee, James Kelly asked me the question about this particular section in the bill. And I did say to him, and I tried to explain why I thought it was important in terms of criminal liability, but I did make the point that I thought the issue around neglect was possibly something that we could reflect further on, because it did seem to me at that point that there was a persuasive argument around the threshold and the fact that it was too low a threshold. And so it is a policy choice to omit or to remove section 4 of the bill. I think it will hopefully address the concerns that a number of those in the performing arts have. And as I say, we have reflected carefully, particularly on the evidence given by the legal community when they came in front of this committee, as well as the performing arts community.
Thanks very much, and apologies, Cabinet Secretary, for not picking that up. And I'm pleased to hear that you've managed to resurrect part 4 of the bill, having inadvertently excised it as well.
Resurrect,
no
that's a
further
good word.
questions.
Thank you, Liam. Can I move from one Liam to the other? Liam Kerr, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to take you to section 6 first of all, the powers of entry with warrants, so the police powers, because you'll have heard through the evidence sessions that some witnesses expressed concerns about the scope of police powers to investigate allegations of stirring up. So are you satisfied, having heard that evidence, that police powers of entry, search and seizure are appropriately circumscribed in this bill, or is there more to be done?
No, I was interested in that discussion when it took place in front of the committee. I noticed from, again, an operational perspective, Police Scotland thought they were, and I'm quoting here, fairly traditional powers of search under a warrant. I also thought the evidence you took from the Crown on this was remarkably helpful, because the Crown went into detail in terms of the application of a warrant. You know, not simply a police officer saying I need a warrant and a court, of course, granting that warrant. But of course, there's a much more deeper consideration that takes place. And Police Scotland said in their evidence, police officers will need to ensure that the evidence is compelling or convincing enough to take to a court in order to get a warrant in the first place. I thought, again, as I say, the quotes from, and I won't read it in full by any stretch, but the Crown was exceptionally important to mitigate some of the concerns that were raised. For example, I noticed some concerns were raised by the Federation, the Police Federation, in relation to police staff. So again, that was dealt with by the Crown, particularly in relation to forensics. So I'm satisfied with the power that's there. There was a question about whether that power should be time limited, and again, I think that's worthy of further consideration post stage 1.
Thank you for that. That, of course, operates in circumstances where there's been a report, where there's an investigation, but we heard quite a lot of evidence about this chilling effect, if you like, that could operate. So, having heard the committee's evidence, do you think that the bill as drafted could have that chilling effect on writers, on journalists, on artists, such that the bill might, as we heard, cast a long shadow, particularly over people's fear of that investigation?
Well, I would certainly hope not. I accept the point that, again, going back to the question of perception, that there could be a perception that the bill does restrict people's freedom of expression or journalistic expression. And therefore, that's why we made the changes that we did to move the new offences to intent only and remove the likely limb, because I was persuaded by the fact that at the very least there was a perception that might infringe upon people's freedom of expression, and therefore we wouldn't want people, particularly journalists and writers, etc., to be self-censoring. That wasn't what the bill was to be about. So I would hope that the changes I've made, I've proposed to make come stage 2, including the changes I've proposed to make that I've announced today, will help to mitigate any concerns about a chilling effect on free speech.
Final question from me, Cabinet Secretary, in this section, and it's just related to that final point you made. There's a reasonableness defence contained within the bill. Having heard the evidence, what changes do you think still require to be made to the way that the bill is providing for a reasonable defence, perhaps that would reassure people in the way that you've just described?
Having moved to intent only, I'm not sure there is a need to make substantive changes to the reasonableness defence. Though again, I'm really looking forward to reading what the stage 1 report of the committee says in this regard. So in some regards, I would maybe flip the question back and say, you know, could somebody give me an example of where somebody's behaviour was threatening or abusive and intended to stir up hatred in relation to the new offences, but was reasonable? And this, I think I said that in my first evidence session when I came in front of committee, and to this day I haven't been given a really good answer to that question. I also noticed the evidence from, for example, the Faculty of Advocates in relation to the reasonableness defence. The Dean of the Faculty said, and again a quote, the difficulty with non-exhaustive lists is where to stop before you become exhausted. And I thought that was a pretty good, and Roddy Dunlop, the Dean of the Faculty, has got a good way of putting these matters, and I thought that was a point well made, and that would be my concern if we introduced a non-exhaustive list. But look, I'll continue to listen to the evidence or indeed read the recommendation from the committee at the stage 1 report on this.
Thank you. I'd like to bring in Annabel Ewing now, please, who I think wants to ask questions about other aspects of the stirring up offences. Annabel.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the Cabinet Secretary and to his officials. I just looking at the issue of possible defences exceptions, the issue of the so-called dwelling house exception has been raised, citing the 1986 Public Order Act, although we did hear at the same time that the Law Commission of England and Wales is proposing the removal of the dwelling house exception. But we've heard evidence, looking at both sides of this. Some folk uneasy. We've heard evidence, on the other hand, from Michael Clancy, the Law Society of Scotland, who said that for most aspects of the criminal law, he did not think that there should be, nor was there, a sanctuary. And in terms of what happens in the dwelling house, and he felt that that should be the case also with regard to hate speech. And interestingly, we also heard from Dr. Andrew Tickell, who kind of essentially made the same point as a matter of law, that the criminal law did not stop just at the doors of the dwelling house, but he did recognise that, for example, with common law breach of the peace, there was brought in the requirement to have a kind of public element involved. And I was just wondering, therefore, taking into account in particular that evidence, whether the Cabinet Secretary would be prepared to consider an amendment to that effect, whereby there would at the very least have to be some sort of public element to the conduct at issue.
Well, again, I'll continue to preface my remarks by saying that, of course, if anybody brings forward an amendment, or indeed this committee bring forward a recommendation in their stage 1 report, I'll of course give it very serious consideration. But if anything, listening to the evidence that Annabel Ewing has just quoted, particularly from the legal experts and also the operational partners on the ground, I found that they were very robust, or the majority of them, not all of them, very robust in relation to their concerns around a so-called dwelling defence. You've quoted some of that evidence. Important to also say the operational partners involved in this, Police Scotland, also said it was noted that it was not unusual to see crimes of such significance that they would be applied in the home, and there wouldn't be a dwelling defence. Their view very much the dwelling defence should not apply. So there was a number of those from the legal fraternity and also the operational partners who did not agree with a dwelling defence. I take the point, though, that there was equally a number of stakeholders who did wish to see that dwelling defence. In fact, I've met with many of them, Christian Institute, for example, being one that I met with. So I'll continue to listen to the arguments around this question of there being a public element to it. Again, I would be interested to see how that would be defined. You mentioned breach of the peace, for example. So if there was an amendment brought forward, of course I would give that consideration. I suppose the area where I could see the most persuasive argument for some sort of safeguard would be around the racial stirring up offence, because that continues to have the likely threshold. It's not intent only, and of course continues to have the insulting threshold, if that is how the bill ends up. So if there was one aspect or one area of the bill where I thought there could be an additional safeguard, or I'd be open-minded to that, it would probably be more so on the racial stirring up offence.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. It's encouraging to note that he will reflect on this issue further should the committee wish to make any particular point. Just as a matter of information, looking at the evidence given by Dr. Tickell, the relevant case, and I'm sure his officials will know this, but the relevant case is Harris versus HMA, decided in 2009 on the public element to common law breach of the peace. So that indeed perhaps is something that the officials might wish to study in greater detail. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Annabel. Cabinet Secretary, just got a couple of supplementaries on that evidence before I bring in John Finney to move the questions on to a different area. The proposed amendments that you've announced today were trailed in the Sunday Press in an interview that you gave with Danny Garavelli in Scotland on Sunday. And I hope I'm correct, quoting from that article correctly when I read this: the bill could not, as some have claimed, be used to target dinner table conversation, but it could be used in relation to events organised in a private home. I can't remember now if that's a quotation exactly or a paraphrase of what the article said, but is that your understanding, that the bill could not, as some have claimed, be used to target dinner table conversation?
Depends on what you mean by target, and forgive me, I'll need to look at whether it was a quote or whether it was paraphrasing or not. But for me, the bill isn't about specifically targeting dinner table conversations. Of course, if there is the stirring up of hatred that meets the threshold, so the behaviour is threatening or abusive for the new offences, is threatening or abusive, and with the intent of stirring up hatred, and that is done round the dinner table with 10 of your mates, and that can be proven beyond reasonable doubt, then that would be prosecuted, potentially under the offence. So there's no duality around that.
I mean, that's my understanding. What you've just said is my understanding also of what the bill would entail, which is different, I think, from what was written in the papers on Sunday.
I would have to look at.
But thank you for clarifying. I mean, at least we understand the bill in the same way as far as that's concerned. I also want just before I bring John Finney in, I just want to ask one final supplementary on the stirring up offences before we move on, which is on the back of Liam Kerr's question, because as you know, the committee has heard evidence about the way in which those who want to argue about the meaning of the word woman has been brought to the attention of the police as a hate crime incident. So can I just ask you this question very straightforwardly? Could the bill, if enacted in its present form, be used to criminalise the expression of the opinion that biological sex is immutable?
No. Not as an opinion solely based on an opinion that may well be offensive to some, it may be controversial to others, it may be absolutely the mainstream view for many others, but simply expressing an opinion isn't itself criminal. If the behaviour that accompanies that expression is proven beyond reasonable doubt, that it was intended that you stirred up hatred and also was threatening or abusive, then of course you may well face some criminal sanction, and that is not down to the perception of any particular victim or anybody in society, but an objective analysis by the court. So in expressing an opinion by saying that a trans woman is not a woman in itself is not going to lead to a prosecution under this legislation.
What if it wasn't merely the expression of an opinion, but campaigning for the position to be understood that biological sex is immutable? Are there circumstances in which you could, unless we take great care to ensure that the term abusive is objectively and not subjectively understood, and you're resisting that proposed amendment at the moment, is there a way in which campaigning on a position that says that biological sex is immutable could be caught by the terms of this bill?
Okay, so what you're doing, and I don't think there's any intent behind this, but you're not referencing the second part of the objective test, which is there has to be the intent to stir up hatred. So even if somebody could argue a course of behaviour was abusive, that in itself is not enough under this legislation to lead to a stirring up offence. The behaviour would have to be proven beyond reasonable doubt by a court of law that that person or organisation intended to stir up hatred. And again, I cannot see how somebody campaigning in a non-threatening or abusive manner without the intent to stir up hatred would be captured as an offence under this legislation.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I'm going to move on to John Finney now, who's been waiting very patiently, as he always does. John.
Thank you very much indeed, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and good morning, colleagues of the Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, I want to ask you about the continued use of statutory aggravations, which has been widely welcomed. Can I ask you in two specific areas? Because we all want to do our very best. I'm very keen that there are no unintended consequences, and that also that we don't miss anything out. So on the question of age, I think you may be aware of the generality, if not in detail, of work that's commissioned by the Justice Committee following our look at the subject was elder abuse. And this was research undertaken by Dr. Hannah Bowes of Durham Law School. And if I quote selectively from it, she says, there is insufficient evidence to support the introduction of a statutory aggravator of age or elder abuse. Absolutely no evidence that violence/abuse against older people is usually, often, or even sometimes committed by offenders who have a hatred of or hostility towards older people. Now, in the text of her report, she gives examples from other jurisdictions where that particular aggravation is barely used at all, in some instances not used. Can you comment on that, please? As I say, of course we want to do our very best, but we want to evidence the reason for putting in that aggravator. Can you give some background?
So a couple of things, similar to my response to the question on race, notwithstanding the evidential base, which is incredibly important, so too are the voices of those that are often impacted. And he will have noticed on the age spectrum, from Youth Scotland right the way through to Age Scotland, there was support for an age aggravator. So I think those voices and those calls from those who represent the real life experience of people on the ground must be given sufficient weight. I think the second thing I would say is that it would not be hard to envisage in the current climate that we live in, if we were to take a number of factors into account, the way certain people well, the age demographics of how people voted in various different referendums, for example, Brexit referendum, the Scottish independence referendum, or in the midst of the current global pandemic, in terms of how the pandemic and the virus has affected younger people, how it's affected older people. You could see where, for example, there may be, unfortunately, cases where people are targeted in a very unpleasant, unsavoury way because of their age. And therefore, I think an age aggravator for all those reasons is something that we will continue to contain within the bill, as well as, of course, it was a recommendation by Lord Bracadale. So I'm always happy to look at evidence papers, and again, the committee will come forward with its own stage 1 recommendation. But at this stage, I would be keen to retain the bill as it is in relation to an age aggravator.
Okay, thank you for that comment. Can I raise another issue then that I think links with this, and that is that Lord Bracadale recommended that the Scottish Government consider the creation of an aggravation covering exploitation and vulnerability. Now, it was Lord Bracadale's view that this would not fit within the scope of hate crime and should be looked at separately. Now, the policy memorandum says in the longer term, the Scottish Government will consider whether there should be reforms to the criminal law to improve the protection available to people who may be at increased risks of becoming victims of a crime because of that vulnerability. What gap are you trying to fill there, or what gap would be filled there? Can you give examples? And isn't, given that this is consolidating legislation, this the vehicle to take forward any gap that you're seeking, that discussion would be full?
So forgive me, I may be misunderstanding, but John Finney and I think, have maybe slightly different interpretations of what Lord Bracadale said. So my understanding on the question of vulnerability was that he did think this issue of people being exploited because of the vulnerability should be looked at, but not within the hate crime framework. He didn't view it as, so he didn't view that as a hate crime per se, but he did believe, and I would align myself with his opinion, that people can be targeted because of their perceived vulnerability. And he asked the government to look at that out with the hate crime framework, and I'm happy to do that. I need to get the hate crime bill, frankly, through the door and pass through Parliament, and there should be a consideration of vulnerability there. In terms of the age aggravator, that would look to prosecute somebody in relation to hatred because of somebody's age, because of their youth, or perhaps because they're older. That is different to being targeted because of a perceived vulnerability, because you are frail, because you have a physical disability potentially, because of some other impairment that you may have, or indeed because of contextual factors you may be vulnerable. So vulnerability is different, hence why Lord Bracadale rightly suggested that should be viewed out with the prism of hate crime.
Would you humour me with the argument that you could say age is about arithmetic, it's a figure, and what we should be covering is what Lord Bracadale talked about, exploitation and vulnerability, rather than something based simply on age?
Except that, there'll be people who are 80 years old that may well look like they are 80 years old. There'll be people that are 80-year-old that will look a lot younger than that, and there'll be people that look a lot older than that, and so therefore they may be targeted in different ways because of the way they look. But it doesn't take away from the fact that there are, I believe, certainly from speaking to our relevant stakeholders, a number of examples that they can give of people being targeted because of, if not their age, at least their perceived age, and therefore I think it's important to add in an aggravator in that regard. I don't know whether, Philip, you wanted to come in on the particular around an age aggravator or not, to add to what I've said.
Nothing very much to add. I mean, I suppose just to confirm, Lord Brackendale was clear that the vulnerability aggravation, the suggestion of that was not a hate crime because it's not motivated by prejudice, it's motivated almost by opportunity. The doorstep scam, etc. And therefore he certainly recommended the government should consider it, but not in the context of this bill.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I commend Dr. Bowe's research to the Cabinet Secretary, which was about that if someone's going to snatch a handbag, they may do it because of age, or they may be doing it simply because they have a propensity to commit crime of that nature. And the examples that jurisdictions where there was an aggravator in, it wasn't used. It was done as the principal offence, where that would be a factor that would be considered in sentence.
Okay.
But I'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Convener.
Thank you, John. I mean, one of just picking up on this line of questioning, one of the characteristics that some witnesses have suggested should be considered for inclusion in the bill is the characteristic of homelessness. And it's not clear to me if offences against those who are sleeping rough on the street are offences which are motivated by prejudice or motivated by vulnerability. It may be that there are categories where vulnerability and prejudice overlap and they're not quite so clearly distinguished as that. Have you considered whether homelessness ought to be added as a hate crime characteristic?
It was considered, and Lord Brackendale makes reference to it in his report, and he makes what I think is quite an important distinction. So I don't disagree with what you say, actually, Convener. I think there can be characteristics where there's potentially an overlap in terms of vulnerability and other factors, but hate crime and the protected characteristics we have are very different to societal factors or socio-economic factors, for example, that can change over time, and we hope they often do change over time. You and I are MSPs, and everybody around this table, virtually or otherwise, number of MSP colleagues here, and we have people coming up to us on a regular basis who are homeless. We do our best to get them a house, to get them secure tenancy, and they hopefully can move on from that homelessness status. I can't do that with my race or religion, for example, or difficult to do with a disability and so on and so forth. So these factors often will change in terms of socioeconomic factors, and therefore very different to the protected characteristics that we have in place. But again, I'm willing to take this conversation further if the Stage 1 report and other stakeholders recommend that we consider it further.
Okay, thank you very much. Rona Mackay, I think, wants to pick up the questioning on aspects relating to race. Rona.
Thank you, Convener. Well, yes, my line of questioning throughout these sessions has been on race, but I think we have covered that pretty extensively at the start. So I'd just like to agree with the Cabinet Secretary. I agree that the removal of the word insulting with regard to race would, in essence, dilute the bill and send out the wrong message. So I'd like to ask the Cabinet Secretary if you would agree that the purpose of this bill, despite a large amount of often misinformed hype surrounding it, is to give reassurance to victims that hate crime of any kind is not acceptable in Scotland and they will always be protected by the law.
Yes, I mean, I think ultimately, of course, that's correct. I do also recognise, though, that people have expressed concerns around how far the bill will go in terms of freedom of expression. I don't dismiss that concern that people have had. So the bill is absolutely about those protections, but it's also about giving as much reassurance as we possibly can that people's freedom of speech, freedom of expression, etc. is protected. And I've often said that I don't think there has to be a conflict between the two. You can get that balance right, and the two can work hand in hand. There are very, very few examples that people who give where freedom of expression is almost unfettered. Probably the United States and its constitution is one of those examples, but in many other cases in the world there is some form of hate crime legislation, particularly in the Western world and in Europe. So I think it is important to give and afford the protections to people in relation to hate crime. I think that's absolutely vital, but I don't want to dismiss, and I wouldn't dismiss, the concerns that people have around getting that balance right in relation to freedom of expression.
Thank you, Convener.
On the subject of race, Cabinet Secretary, if the existing offence of racially aggravated harassment is to be retained, why not consolidate it into this bill?
Yeah, I mean, I'm open-minded to looking at 50A again. I thought the questioning on this was helpful. Although, unless I'm mistaken, I'm happy to look over the transcript again. I don't think the question on 50A was asked in terms of the groups that you had here in relation to race, because it would have been interesting to have heard their perspective. The reason why we wouldn't consolidate it is because it wouldn't fit in with the hate crime framework, essentially. But again, I'm happy to pass over to Philip or Bill if they want to give more detail to that answer.
It's really just to add to that, it's obviously a standalone offence, but certainly, as the Cabinet Secretary has indicated, if the committee, for example, considered that it should be retained but should be part of this set of hate crime laws, that can definitely be considered as a stage 2 amendment.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Are there any, unless there are any other members wanting to ask questions about race or about that offence, we'll move on to other hate crime characteristics. And Annabel Ewing wants to take up the questioning there. Please, Annabel.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, turning to the issue of what formed actually a lot of the discussion that we had in our first panel this morning. I don't know if the Cabinet Secretary had an opportunity to listen to that or some of it. Looking specifically at the characteristic of sex, as we have noted over the weeks, notwithstanding that Lord Brackendale recommended that this be included as a hate crime characteristic, it thus far has not been formally included within the scope of the bill. And perhaps the Cabinet Secretary could take this opportunity today to explain his rationale in this regard, and perhaps picking up some of the points raised in our earlier session if he has had the opportunity to hear them. Thank you.
So I hope the member will forgive me. I was at a different committee this morning, so I did catch some of the evidence session towards the end, but I probably missed what would have been the substantial part of that discussion, the first part of that evidence session. In terms of my own view on this, I hope I gave an indication in my first evidence session to committee that I'd be open-minded to hearing views from committee members, committee itself, of course, and stakeholders on this, because I can certainly understand the concerns of a number of stakeholders around the omission of a statutory aggravator in relation to sex. What I would say, and again, I couldn't say if you definitely heard this evidence, but I'm certain if you had Emma Rich and Dr. Marsha Scott in front of you, then they would have pointed to what they believe to be some of the risks around the statutory aggravator, how it might be misused, for example, by a domestic abuse perpetrator, how the evidential basis for it, and Engender are particularly strong on this, how the evidential basis on this they think is weak. And so ultimately, having listened to those stakeholders, the largest stakeholders, most established stakeholders when it comes to women and women's rights in Scotland, they were pretty unanimous in their view. I'm talking about here Scottish Women's Aid, Rape Crisis Scotland, Zero Tolerance and Engender. They were pretty unanimous in their view that a statutory aggravator could potentially do more harm than do good. Now, I could have just removed it, left it, removed from the bill and not created an order-making power, but I was keen that this issue was revisited in greater amounts of detail, hence the evidence sessions that you've had, but undoubtedly the work that the misogynistic harassment working group will do. I would like them to look at this. Having spoken to Baroness Kennedy, she's keen to make progress in that regard and look at this issue. And of course, at any future date, that would of course allow that power, that aggravator to be added to the bill through an order-making power.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer, and certainly, a lot of the evidence we heard this morning I thought was really interesting, particularly from Emma Rich, and she cited certain pieces of evidence I certainly would wish to go away and have a look at in more detail to get a better handle on the risks that she raised, in particular of unintended consequences, because of course we wouldn't want to do anything that would make it worse for women than it currently is. And obviously the committee will reflect on all these matters. Turning to the issue specifically of the proposed working group on misogynistic harassment, and can I just say at the outset, I very much welcome the announcement that this is to be chaired by Baroness Helena Kennedy. I mean, I think that's a great coup, if I may say so, on the part of the Scottish Government, because I think her track record speaks for itself. But looking to the work of that working group, does the Cabinet Secretary yet have any information to share about likely membership, the remit, and particularly the timescale? Because one point I think that emerged very clearly this morning was we don't want to hang around and be discussing the intricacies of this in 10 years' time. We need to move forward with some urgency with regard to this issue. So with that in mind, perhaps the Cabinet Secretary could advise as to these matters if he's in a position to do so. Thank you.
So again, I hope, Annabelle, you will forgive me slightly, because I am going to be a little bit coy in the sense that I have appointed Baroness Kennedy to take forward this work. I think it's really important that she directs the work of that working group. It's free from kind of ministerial interference, and I think she should determine the membership. The remit is certainly something that we've had initial discussions on. I mentioned in my first evidence session when I came in front of committee some of the phasing, of that working group and what I thought they had to consider in terms of the evidence base they had to gather, in terms of the detailed mapping of the law as it currently stands to determine whether or not there's any gaps in the law around this area, and then to make proposals thereafter. But in terms of the detail of the remit and the membership, that should really be for Baroness Kennedy. In terms of the timescale, I would agree with what Annabelle Ewing has said, and I did catch that latter bit of the evidence from the representative of For Women Scotland, where she said that discussions on this had happened over the last decade or even longer, and she didn't wish for those discussions to continue for another decade. I thought it was a very reasonable point to make. So I can give an assurance to Annabelle Ewing that when Baroness Kennedy and I spoke yesterday afternoon, there certainly was no desire to dither or delay, and that we would agree that this work should move forward with pace.
Okay, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, and obviously we hope to see, I would imagine, in the weeks to come, further announcements being made on all these issues that I raised with the Cabinet Secretary. Turning lastly, if I may, Convener, to another area where we have heard evidence and differences of opinion as to the best approach, and that concerns specifically the variations of sexual characteristics. And we heard, I believe it was last week, forgive me, each week is COVID is trying to difficult to remember which week is which week, but I believe it was last week, and we did hear some particular views expressed by the DSD families in Scotland, so that's differences in sexual development, and they didn't seem quite convinced that this was the best approach. And I would also have to say, Cabinet Secretary, but I'm sure you've already seen reference to that in the official report of our evidence session, they didn't also feel that they had been given a fair hearing to ensure that their view was expressed. Perhaps the Cabinet Secretary could respond to that issue. Thank you.
On the latter point, I'm happy to continue to engage with any stakeholder. So if DSD families don't feel that they've been engaged, then of course we can pick that back up. I also did note that DSD families provided a written submission, so I was very aware of their views on the back of that written submission to the Justice Committee's call for evidence. And while I, of course, absolutely respect their opinion, it's also fair to say that there are a number of stakeholders who hold a different view, who do think that variation in sex characteristics, first of all, is the right term to use, and I know terminology can be really difficult I'm certain we'll get into further discussions, no doubt, around that, but terminology can be challenging, but a number of stakeholders did agree that variation of sex characteristics was the correct term. But secondly, they did also believe that there should be an aggravator that covers those variations in sex characteristics. That doesn't take away from anything that DSD family said about the need for greater health support, greater mental health support, not just for children, but also for the parents of children who may be affected by a variation of sex characteristic as well. So I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think you can give that support as well as having an aggravator. So yeah, we'll continue to engage, but also in this regard, there may be a disagreement in our approach, but that won't stop us from engaging.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer, and it's very welcome indeed that he will continue to engage with DSD Families Scotland. And indeed, they did raise wider issues beyond the scope of this bill, and hopefully those can be looked at, because I'm aware that they've been raising those issues for quite some time. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Annabelle. I've got John Finney, Fulton McGregor and Bill Kidd who all want to come in on this area, but Liam Kerr has a very brief supplementary. Is it directly on what we've just been talking about, Liam?
Yes, it is, Convener. It's about the terminology. It's just a question you might have seen me put this morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'm just interested in something. The section 14.6b talks about persons of a different sex, but just looking back, the Offences Aggravated by Prejudice Act and I think the Equality Act talk about persons of an opposite sex. So we've got a difference in terms here, and I just wonder, why have we got a difference in terms, and would it be better to use opposite as our term for consistency to avoid perhaps the inevitable legal argument that you mean something different by the use of different as against opposite?
So again, officials can jump in and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think the use of different sex is also the definition that's used in equal marriage legislation, but I will double check that shortly. As I say, terminology is often changing and evolving. I think the difference also would be that opposite would suggest that there has to be, there's only really two options, A and the opposite being B, whereas that might not fit when it comes to people who are non-binary. So they may not feel opposite to a male or opposite to a female. And I think it's seen by equality organisations as being more inclusive, particularly of non-binary people, and that's why the difference is used. But I'm happy for Bill or other officials who may be online who may wish to come in to add to that difference in relation to terminology. No, I'm not sure if my officials, particular ones, want to come in, but Bill, do you want to add anything?
I was just going to say what you said is correct. I mean, Rachel maybe want to come in.
Rachel, do you want to come in on this? Sorry, forgive me, I know she's online. Rachel, do you want to come in on anything to add to this particular question?
Yes, not much to add. Just to clarify that the Marriage and Civil Partnership Act is mixed sex, opposed to different, but it's the same kind of principle that an Equality Network in Stonewall Scotland, just to note that they were supportive of the move away from opposite, just as the Cabinet Secretary suggested, so it's a more inclusive approach.
Okay, Jeff, forgive me, mixed sex. So it's different language being used in different bills, and I understand your concern about, well, where there could be confusion. But yes, I think seen as more inclusive of particularly non-binary people.
Very grateful, thank you.
Thank you, Liam. I think Liam MacArthur also wants a supplementary on the appointment of Baroness Helena Kennedy.
Thanks very much, Convener. Yeah, I mean, certainly to join others in welcoming her appointment. I've no doubt at all that she is absolutely the right person for the job, and will pull together the remit and the membership in a way that there was some confidence that the issues here will be really drilled into. I suppose the concern, and it was one that was raised with you, Cabinet Secretary, when you last appeared before the committee, is the time frame. I hear what you're saying in terms of having this done without undue delay, but I think the concern, across the committee, is the level of oversight that then Parliament is going to have on any recommendations that come forward. That will certainly be well founded, but nevertheless, I'm sure you accept the very real need for Parliament and to be engaged in very robust scrutiny of those proposals, given their significance and potential ramifications.
I completely accept the concerns that Liam McArthur's raised. Currently, as the bill stands, excuse me, we're proposing an affirmative procedure. It could be that we could consider potentially a super affirmative, whereby there would also have to be a consultation if there was to be an order-making power enacted. So, there is scope, I should say, to consider this issue further in order to hopefully mitigate some of the concerns that members may have around parliamentary scrutiny.
Thank you, Convener. I think the ability to take evidence and test the propositions as fully as possible is going to be absolutely essential. So I welcome that assurance, and we'll probably have to return to that. So that's enough, Convener. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Still on the topic of hate crime characteristics, Cabinet Secretary, I think John Finney, Fulton McGregor and Bill Kidd all want to ask questions in this area. So if I could take them in our order, John first and then Fulton, please.
Thank you, Convener. Given colleagues have questions, I have just one very specific question that the Cabinet Secretary may be aware of, and that's Cabinet Secretary relates to calls from the Equality Network, BEMIS and others to, and I quote from them here, a legal requirement to be integrated into the bill that places a duty on the Scottish Government, Police Scotland and any other relevant duty bearers to develop a bespoke system of hate crime data collection and disaggregation across characteristics covered by the bill. We've heard throughout our evidence the importance of data. Is that something you're considering, that bespoke hate crime?
So in brief, I'm very sympathetic to the proposal, but as committee members have questioned me before, there would possibly be an implication in relation to data, in terms of IT systems by our stakeholders, both Police Scotland and the Crown in particular, and therefore that might come at some financial cost, which we would have to factor into any revised financial memorandum. So those discussions around disaggregated data and the potential for a legal duty around disaggregated data being in the bill, the implications of that, that's something that is being discussed with partners, and I'd be open-minded to further consideration on the matter.
Okay, thank you very much. That's me, Convener. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. Fulton McGregor, please.
Thanks, Convener, and good afternoon to the Cabinet Secretary and his officials. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that the Scottish Commission for Learning Disability has called for specific recognition of learning disability within the listed characteristics. Cabinet Secretary, can I ask what your views are on this, and if you heard the evidence that we got in that, and perhaps if you could comment on, even if it's not listed as a separate hate crime characteristic, do you agree that disaggregated data for hate crime focused on different types of disability should be available, similar to John Finney's line of questioning there?
So just to confirm that learning disability would be covered by the current definition of disability. So I don't think there would have to be a separate category. The current definition of disability in the bill includes a quote-unquote physical or mental impairment of any kind. So I don't think a separate category would be necessary. On the second point, I just go back to what I said to John Finney, that I do think we need to show a greater level of disaggregation, and that should include, but not limited to, disability as well. So we will reflect on that and continue to have conversations with stakeholders on that.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that. I apologise for the wee bit of doubling up there. And in relation to my second question as well, Convener, if that's all right, this is something that I asked you in your first appearance, Cabinet Secretary, and I wonder now that we've heard all the evidence, if your view is still the same, and that is the government open to considering the possibility of adding further hate crime characteristics? The Convener has already spoke about homelessness, but also the other areas we've been asked about are refugees and asylum seekers. And I know that I did ask you this in the first session, so I'll give you the opportunity to either reiterate your point from then or to advise the government are reconsidering.
So just my view on this is still the same. Of course, again, we always continue to reflect on the evidence, but as things stand, and Lord Brackadale referenced in his report, I believe that the current definitions as they exist would cover asylum seekers and refugees. So at this stage, you don't see a need for a separate aggravation.
Thanks for that, Cabinet Secretary. That's me, and I give my apologies to Bill Kidd if I've taken up any space he was looking to speak about.
Thank you, Fulton. Bill, do you have anything you want to add?
No, it's fine, and thank you very much, though, and no problem at all from Fulton McGregor. The fact of the matter is that these are incredibly important issues, and whoever in the committee brings them up, we got decent answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. In that case, we'll move on to Liam Kerr, please.
Thank you, Convener. So I'd like to turn to costs and the financial memorandum that I've explored throughout these sessions. And just as a prelude to this, I noticed in your answer there, Cabinet Secretary, to John Finney, that you talked about a need to revise the financial memorandum. And with that in mind, you'll recall I asked, in fact, the last time you were here, Cabinet Secretary, about the cost to the SCTS. And I believe that there was a meeting on the 9th of September between the SCTS and the COPFS to resolve issues on recording offences aggravated by characteristics. What are your thoughts on the outcome of that meeting? And are you now content that the SCTS and the financial memorandum sufficiently understand or are sufficiently accounted for?
Yeah, so just to be clear, that a revised financial memorandum is nothing unusual after Stage 2 amendments have passed, for example, that might alter or change the nature of a bill and increase particular financial burdens or costs on an organisation or indeed government. So when I talk about a revised financial memorandum, I mean in the normal course of the passage of a bill, particularly through Stage 2 amendments. In terms of the latter part of your question, I would need to look at the notes of that particular meeting, but I can tell the member that I speak to the Scottish Courts Tribunal Service every fortnight, if not usually even more than that, but certainly at least every fortnight. And I've raised this issue with Eric McQueen, Chief Executive of the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service, earlier this month, and he certainly gave me a very strong indication that those issues were being resolved well with the implementation team at Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service and the government. And he didn't think there was any significant issues, but clearly everybody is waiting to see how the bill may well be amended come Stage 2, and that might have some implications on that discussion, but he certainly seemed to be in a more positive place.
Just on a similar point then, it's obviously very important, and this will have been projected for regardless of amendments, no doubt, but that the police and those others who will apply the law will get appropriate training. But also there's the other side of that, which is that the public, and I think the point was made earlier in one of the sessions today, that the public understand what the bill says and what their rights and responsibilities are. What discussions has the Scottish Government been having with the various agencies on those issues?
So we speak extensively to Police Scotland about the implications of the bill and what implications it may have on training, for example, as well as IT systems. So I think it's a point well made. It is worth just reminding ourselves that the vast majority of hate crime will still be prosecuted under the statutory aggravations, which continue to be in various parts of the legislative framework as things stand, with the exception of age, which is the obviously additional aggravator we're proposing. So for the vast majority of hate crime that's investigated and prosecuted, you wouldn't think that there would be a need for any particular additional training because it's under the current statutory aggravator model. That's not to say there won't be any. I think there will be some. But I was quite convinced and persuaded by the answer that you received in front of committee from Police Scotland about this, but also that the evidence they provided to the Finance Committee, that the discussions that they had were positive. I'm keen to speak again to the Police Federation. I spoke to them shortly after I announced changes to the bill on the 23rd of September. And then I had a further conversation with them thereafter. Forgive me, I can't remember exactly the date. But I'd be keen that, again, as the bill progresses and potentially is amended, that we continue the conversations with the trade unions, like the Federation, as well as Police Scotland themselves.
Very grateful, thank you.
Thank you. Next question, I think, Rona Mackay, please. We need to unmute Rona's
Hate crime.
microphone. Thank you. Rona, sorry, can you start again? We didn't catch the beginning. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, we know that the underreporting of hate crime is a problem. So can I ask you what the government is doing to tackle this, maybe by way of public awareness campaigns, and also, what support is there for victims of hate crimes at the moment?
So I've always accepted that legislation is not in itself going to rid Scotland of hate crime, a goal that we probably all would hopefully associate ourselves with, but legislation is one part of a suite of measures that we can have to tackle hate crime and build a much more inclusive and equal society. But it is an important part. I mean, I talk from personal experience as well, as somebody who's been the target of hate crime, and actually recently there's been a successful prosecution in that regard. I think legislation is important, but in itself isn't going to solve the problem. Education is hugely important. We need to make sure we do the marketing campaigns that we do, I think, addressing and people's prejudices. So we have that campaign which was relaunched in October this year. This was the Letters from Scotland hate campaign, which you may have seen on the side of bus shelters or perhaps on various billboards. But also the money that we invest in education, I think is hugely important. And I've seen some of examples of that in my constituency. I've seen great examples of a number of organisations, like, for example, Show Racism the Red Card, going into high schools and indeed primary schools in my constituency, making a big difference. So I suppose, in short, legislation itself is not going to resolve the issue, is not going to eliminate hate crime in itself, but we'll continue to invest in education programmes as well as marketing campaigns to raise awareness of the issue.
Thank you, convener.
Thank you very much. I don't think that there are any other members who wish to ask questions, Cabinet Secretary, unless they catch my eye in the room or on Blue Jeans. But can I just ask you a couple of questions about timetabling before we go? Now, given the huge public interest in this bill, which is understandable for all sorts of reasons, given the fact that you have now twice come to Parliament to announce that you propose to make amendments to the bill at stage 2, and given that this committee is working as hard as it can to meet the government's preferred timetable for this bill, assuming that our stage 1 report is published by the 11th of December, can you commit today that your response, the government's response to that report, will be published in advance of the stage 1 debate on this bill in the Parliament, which is scheduled, as I understand it, for Tuesday the 15th of December? Now, I know your officials won't thank me for that question because it means that they will all have to be working over the weekend to get that done. But given how much this bill has changed at your own hand, and given the huge public interest in it, which is understandable for all sorts of reasons, I do not think it would be appropriate for this Parliament to debate this bill at stage 1 until we have seen your response to our stage 1 report. And I hope you share that view and will commit to ensure that that response is published in advance of the debate.
So just if I can be clear, forgive me, I don't have my calendar in front of me, but going and judging by what you've said, is the 11th of December Friday? Thursday, Friday, okay. And so that would leave us with one working day to respond to what I assume will be a very substantial report, given the number of panels that you have rightly taken evidence from. So today you will have, from now till the 11th, 14 working days approximately to draft the report, and we will have one working day to respond to it. Now, I accept your general premise that a lot of this is because of the changes that have been announced and proposed by government. So if I may be so bold as to urge the committee that if it is possible to publish that report before the 11th of December, the government team would be eternally grateful. Any extra days that we are given to respond, if we are given just that one day to respond, I will ensure a response. I can't promise you it would be as detailed, of course, a response if we were given a greater period of time, but we will endeavour to get a response to the report, even if we are given just one working day to do so. So I would hope there could be some element of close collaboration between the government and the committee in relation to the report. If it can be that the committee, and I don't doubt what you say at all in terms of how hard you're working, and I should say I appreciate the amount of effort that the committee has put in and the number of people and stakeholders you've taken evidence from, including indulging me twice. But if it can be, the report can be published before the 11th, any extra days we can get, then the better. But
the other way of creating extra days, of course, would be to move the stage 1 debate until later in that week.
yes. Well, again, we're happy to look at that, consider that potentially, as well with the Minister for Parliamentary Business. You'll be aware just of my anxieties around the tight timetable, but it's a fair point, so we will go and reflect on that. But look, even if the timetable is as you say it, as you articulate it, and there is only that one day, we will provide a response. I will commit to that. It just, of course, logically goes to speak that if we had longer, we could provide more of a definitive response.
Good. Thank you for that, Cabinet Secretary. I mean, of course, we'll collaborate and cooperate where we can in terms of not trying to surprise the government at the last minute or anything like that. That's not part of my agenda at all. But I do think that it would be inappropriate for this Parliament to debate this bill at stage 1 until we have heard not only what the committee has to say about it, but also what the government has to say in response to what the committee has to say. I think we owe that to all of the people who've given us evidence, not just oral evidence, but written evidence over the course of the last few months. And the reason why we are working at this breakneck pace is because of the timetable that the government has set down. So I'm glad to have on your record your commitment that there will be at least some form of stage 1 response from the government before the Parliament debates this bill at stage 1. So thank you for that.
I'm not sure you've made me popular with my officials, but I'm happy to commit to...
I'm not sure I've made myself popular with your officials, either, Cabinet Secretary, but that wasn't, with all respect to them, my first consideration today. Thank you very much to you and indeed to your officials for the time that you've given us this morning and this afternoon on the hate crime bill. If you just stay with us for a few moments more, because I think we need you for our next item of business. I don't need to suspend before we move to that item. I think we can move straight on. And our next item of business today is consideration of the following affirmative instrument, namely the International Organisations, Immunities and Privileges Scotland Revocation Order 2021. And does the Cabinet Secretary want to make any remarks about this instrument?
Well, I think it's just important for me to say that the draft International Organisations, Immunities and Privileges Revocation Order 2021 amends the International Organisations, Immunity and Privileges Scotland Order 2009 to revoke Schedule 17 in relation to privileges and immunities conferred in respect of the Unified Patent Court. It wholly revokes the International Organisations, Immunities and Privileges Scotland Amendment Number 2, Order 2017, which is the instrument that inserted Schedule 17 into 2009 order. It's simply done because, given the UK's withdrawal from the European Union, the UK will now obviously not seek to participate in the Unitary Patent or Unified Patent Court. It would be highly then undesirable for any immunity to exist in the statute book where it's unnecessary. So I don't think I will say any more than that. I'm just happy to take any questions, if there are any from committee members.
There are, and the first question is from John Finney, please.
Now, long-standing members of the committee will know that I often speak in these matters, and immunities and privileges. I understand their place in international law and diplomacy indeed, but can I absolutely commend, I appreciate this isn't necessarily at the hand of the Cabinet Secretary that will come here, can I commend the word revocation, and I hope to see many such orders appearing in front of the committee in the days that come ahead. Thank you.
I'm not sure that's a question, so I will just allow John Finney to have his moment on the record.
Indeed, I am sure that it wasn't a question, but I thank Mr Finney for his comment anyway. No further members have indicated that they wish to ask a question of you, Cabinet Secretary, about this instrument. So the next item is for formal consideration of the motion in relation to the instrument we've just discussed. I need to report that the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has considered and reported on the instrument and had no comments to make about it. And the motion is therefore that. The Justice Committee recommends that the International Organisations, Immunities and Privileges Scotland Revocation Order 2021 in draft be approved. Can I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move?
Happy to move, Convener.
So the question is that the motion which has just been moved in the name of Hamza Youssef be approved. Are we all agreed?
Yep. Yes.
We are all agreed. I invite the committee to agree to delegate to me the publication of a short factual report on our deliberations on the statutory instrument today. And with that, we can conclude our consideration of it. I thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials for attending. This brings the public part of our meeting to a close, and our next meeting will be tomorrow evening, probably at 7 o'clock, when we will meet in private to begin our consideration of this draft Stage 1 report on the Hate Crime and Public Order Bill. I now close the public part of this meeting and we will move into private.